You spent 40 years pouring concrete and reading blueprints, and that's supposed to impress somebody? You're an embarrassment. Marcus doesn't hide his money in a garage full of tools. He built something real. I wish to God he'd been my father instead of you. My daughter said that to me across a table at the finest restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, loud enough for 3 other tables to hear every word. She'd practiced it. I could tell. There was no shake in her voice, no hesitation, just the flat, rehearsed cruelty of someone who had been waiting for the right audience to say it in front of. Her husband, Trent, smiled into his wine glass like he'd just watched his favorite team score. My ex-wife, Diane, the woman I had married at 24 and buried nothing but patience with for 18 years, looked down at her bread plate and said not one word in my defense. And across the table, the man himself, Marcus Holloway, the real estate visionary who had swept Diane off her feet 5 years after our divorce, leaned back in his chair like a king accepting tribute, and raised his glass an inch in my direction, just enough to make sure I saw it. I want you to picture me sitting there, listening to all of it, feeling the eyes of strangers land on me the way people look at a stray dog that's wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. And here's the strange thing, the thing I need you to understand before anything else. The anger I expected never showed up. What showed up instead was a kind of stillness, cold and clean, like standing at the edge of a lake at 5 in the morning before anyone else is awake. Because my daughter, Renata, 34 years old, a woman I had rocked to sleep more nights than I could count, genuinely believed that every good thing in her life, the marketing firm she ran, the lake house in Hilton Head, the SUV Trent drove to impress his golf buddies, she believed all of it belonged to her and Trent alone, built with nothing but their own hands and their own brilliance. She had no idea that I was the reason any of it existed. And she had no idea that with one phone call, I could make every piece of it disappear inside of 72 hours. My name is Walter Boone. I'm 68 years old, and for 39 years I ran a structural inspection firm here in the Low Country, the kind of business that never makes headlines, but keeps bridges from falling into rivers and buildings from folding in on themselves during a hurricane. I want to walk you through exactly what happened to my family, neighbor to neighbor, because I've turned it over in my mind more nights than I can count, and I still don't know if there are words big enough to hold it. And somewhere along the way, I want you to ask yourself, honestly, what you would have done in my chair. I didn't raise a cruel woman. I need to say that clearly before I go any further, because it would be the easiest thing in the world to paint Renata as a villain from her very first line of dialogue, and that would miss everything that actually matters here. My daughter was raised inside a world that taught her only one lesson counted: how much your life looked like it cost. And the people who taught her that lesson were never me. They were her mother, and the man Diane left me for 5 years after our marriage ended, a smooth-talking, expensively tailored man named Marcus Holloway, who sold waterfront lots to retirees and called it visionary work. The dinner that started everything happened at a restaurant Marcus had chosen. Of course he had. The kind of place with cloth napkins folded into little fans and a wine list thicker than a phone book. I'd been invited, Diane said, because Renata wanted her father there to see how far she'd come. I understand now that wasn't an invitation. It was a stage, and I was the prop they needed to make the performance complete. After Renata delivered her line about Marcus, and after the table went quiet except for the soft clinking of somebody's fork against china 2 tables over, I looked at my daughter, and for 1/2 of 1 second, I saw something else underneath the contempt. I saw the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders at construction sites, wearing a hard hat 3 sizes too big, laughing every time I pointed up at a beam and told her that's what held the whole world up. That flicker was there and gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Then it was buried again under the diamond earrings and the practiced sneer, and I understood, sitting there, that the moment had finally, quietly, arrived. I set my napkin down beside a dessert I hadn't touched. I stood up. My chair didn't make a sound. I looked at Diane, who still wouldn't meet my eyes, then at Marcus, who was still smiling like he'd won something, and finally at my daughter. I didn't say a single word. I turned, and I walked out through the heavy oak doors into the warm, salty Charleston night, and I let them sit there with their hollow little victory, because I didn't need to explain anything to them. My next moves were going to do all the talking I had left in me. I didn't call a car. I walked past the boutique hotels and the horse-drawn carriages full of tourists until the tourist money gave way to my own neighborhood, the quiet street where I'd lived for 30 years, in a house I helped frame with my own hands back when my knees still let me climb a ladder without thinking twice about it. It wasn't a showpiece. It was solid, built to take a storm and still be standing the next morning, same as me. Inside, I didn't turn on the television, and I didn't pour myself a drink, because anger clouds a man's judgment, and that night I needed to think colder than I'd ever thought in my life. I went into the small back room I use as an office, walls covered in old inspection certificates, and a black and white photo of the first bridge I ever signed off on. On the corner of the desk sat a photo of Renata, at 6 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a job site, grinning so wide you could see the gap where she'd lost her first tooth. Where did I lose that girl? The question didn't hit me like a blade. It landed slow and heavy, like something that had been building in me for 15 years and had finally found its moment to speak. I sat down at my desk and opened a program I'd installed years ago, the kind of quiet, encrypted software that most men my age have never heard of and never will. I typed a password. Only one other living person knew, and a short list of folder names appeared on the screen, meaning nothing to anyone except the man who built them. Holding companies, property management firms, a seed investment agreement, a vehicle lease, a monthly consulting arrangement. Each one was an invisible wire I had strung years ago, and my daughter had spent her whole adult life walking across them without once looking down. I opened a secure message to a woman named Priscilla Adair, a sharp, quiet attorney out of Savannah who had built this entire structure with me brick by brick over a decade, and who I trusted with things I'd never told my own family. The message had no pleasantries, just 4 words as the subject line: begin the tide out, and a single instruction underneath it: start unwinding every asset connected to Renata and Trent, beginning with the vehicle. I hit send, and somewhere out in the dark, the first domino tipped forward and balanced right on the edge of the table. I felt no joy sitting there, no satisfaction, just the strange, level calm of an engineer watching a structure he built begin its final stress test. The next morning, Priscilla met me in her office on the 9th floor with 2 cups of black coffee already poured, because she'd read my message at 6 a.m. and knew exactly what kind of morning this was going to be. She sat beside me instead of behind her desk, the way she always did when the conversation wasn't really about paperwork. She told me she'd hoped, honestly hoped, that we'd never have to open that folder. So had I. But the tide was out now, and there was no calling it back in. She asked me to tell her the human part, the part no legal document could ever capture. What was the actual final straw? And I told her. I told her my own daughter had called me an embarrassment in a packed restaurant, had said out loud, in front of strangers, that she wished a stranger were her father, and that her mother had sat there and let every word of it land without lifting a finger to stop it. And the part that cut deepest, I told Priscilla, was that Renata truly, fully believed the life she was living had nothing to do with me. She believed she'd built it herself, brick by brick, with Trent standing right there beside her. Here's where the story turns, and I need you to stay with me on this next part, because it's where you'll understand exactly how badly they had all misjudged the quiet old man in the corner of the room. Years earlier, Priscilla reminded me, Renata had come to me with a business plan for a marketing agency, full of buzzwords about disruption and personal branding, with no real capital behind any of it and even less discipline. I knew if I simply wrote her a check for the amount she was asking for, she'd burn through it in 18 months and learn absolutely nothing except how to ask for more. So I told her my money was tied up in retirement accounts I couldn't touch. She called me small-minded, walked away disappointed, and told her mother I'd never believed in her. But I didn't walk away. I went straight to Priscilla, and together we quietly built a private trust, funded with $1.8 million, registered out of state for privacy, and we created a small holding firm with a friendly retired marketing executive as its public face, a man who genuinely believed he was doing good, honest angel investing. As far as Renata ever knew, she'd been discovered by forward-thinking investors who recognized her talent. She flew to Atlanta, pitched her idea, and walked out with a signed term sheet. She never once wondered why it had all come together so easily. She never asked who actually owned the firm cutting the checks. 60% of her agency belonged to that holding company, which belonged, quietly, entirely, to my trust. Renata held 25% as CEO, which meant, in practice, she didn't own her own company at all. She was its highest paid employee, and her invisible board of directors, for every purpose that mattered, was me. Then there was the SUV, the one Trent insisted they needed to look successful in front of clients and neighbors. His credit had been too thin to lease it under his own name, so the company leased it instead, dressed up through a fleet management firm that was, in reality, one of my holding companies wearing a different name. The contract was explicit, buried in language nobody reads. The moment Trent was no longer employed by that agency, the vehicle reverted immediately. And then the biggest piece? The lake house in Hilton Head. This one, Priscilla said, had always felt different, and I told her it was, because it wasn't really about Renata at all. It was about Diane. After she left me, Diane had become obsessed with the appearance of a good life, and she'd spent years filling our daughter's head with the idea that where you live is who you are. Renata and Trent had hunted for months for the perfect property, something to make their friends jealous on social media, and they found it in a renovated cottage 2 blocks from the water. When Renata asked me to help with the down payment, I told her, gently, that it would be reckless to live so far beyond her means. What I didn't tell her was that I had bought that entire small development 3 years earlier through another one of my companies, back when it was an undervalued stretch of coastline nobody wanted yet. When Renata applied to buy in, the property group, my property group, reached out with a special financing arrangement, low interest, almost no money down, because they wanted a young power couple to add prestige to the neighborhood. Renata signed the paperwork and bragged for months that the developer had personally chosen her. She never read the fine print. Nobody ever does. That fine print made the whole arrangement contingent on her continued employment at the agency, terminable with 72 hours' notice. So there it was, laid out plain on the screen in front of me. Her company, her husband's car, their house by the water. Every single pillar of the life my daughter thought she'd built with her own 2 hands had actually been designed, funded, and quietly owned by the very man she'd called an embarrassment across a dinner table. Priscilla asked me what I wanted to do first, whether I wanted to hit them with everything at once, the car, the accounts, the house, all of it by Monday morning, a full collapse in a single day. I shook my head slowly and told her no, because that would be destruction, that would be revenge, and this was never about revenge, not really. I explained it to her the only way a man who spent his life inspecting buildings knows how to explain anything. When you need to bring down a structure that's rotted from the inside, you don't set dynamite at the foundation and walk away. That's messy. That hurts people who had nothing to do with it. A careful builder does it in stages. You remove the fixtures first, the shiny things that catch the eye. Then the windows, the view of the world from the inside. Then, floor by floor, until all that's left standing is the bare, honest foundation underneath. I didn't want to destroy my daughter. I wanted to dismantle the lie she was living inside of, one piece at a time, until she had no choice but to stand on the cold, hard truth of what was actually hers. So we built a plan. Monday, the vehicle, the most visible symbol of Trent's success, gone by lunchtime. Give them a full day to feel that first loss settle in. Tuesday, freeze the agency's corporate accounts, which would also, quietly and permanently, cut off the monthly consulting fee that had been flowing to Marcus for the past 3 years. Because yes, that thread ran there too. Let the winner feel the pinch alongside them. Wednesday, when Renata was confused and scrambling and calling every number in her phone, deliver the notice on the lake house. Take the ground out from under her one piece at a time, so she'd feel the weight of exactly what she was losing as she lost it, instead of waking up one morning to nothing at all with no understanding of why. Over that weekend, while I was out pruning back the crepe myrtles in my own front yard, my daughter, by every account I pieced together later from frantic voicemails, spent her time congratulating herself. She told her friends she'd finally set boundaries with her difficult, embarrassing father, certain I'd come crawling back within the week the way I always had before. She saw 34 years of my patience not as love, but as weakness. She saw my silence at that dinner table not as a warning, but as surrender. She and Trent even talked about upgrading the kitchen countertops to celebrate. She called Marcus that same weekend looking for praise, and he gave it to her smooth as oil, told her she'd done the right thing, finally cutting ties with a man from a different generation who didn't understand what real ambition looked like. My daughter thanked him warmly and told him it was good to finally have a real role model in her life. A real role model, a man whose entire consulting income for 3 straight years had been a single contract with a company I owned, funneled through my daughter's business, without either of them ever once asking why an outside consultant needed paying that much for advice nobody could actually point to. Monday came. I spent the morning quietly, reading on my back porch with a cup of coffee, knowing that across town the machinery I'd built was starting to turn. Renata told me later, in the one honest conversation we've had since, that Trent walked down to the parking garage in his good suit, feeling untouchable, and found a flatbed truck already backed up to his SUV. Tuesday, the agency's operating accounts froze mid-transaction, in the middle of payroll, in front of her entire staff. She called the bank in a panic and was told, politely, that the account holder listed above her name on the corporate structure had initiated the freeze, and that account holder was not a name she recognized because it wasn't meant to be recognized, not yet. Wednesday, the notice arrived taped to the front door of the lake house, while Renata was standing in the kitchen, deciding on paint samples for the countertop upgrade they'd never get to make. 72 hours to vacate, per the terms she'd signed and never read. That evening, my phone rang. It was Renata, and her voice had none of the polish it carried at that dinner table. It cracked on the very first word. She asked me what was happening to her life, why everything was falling apart at once, whether I knew anything about it. And I told her the truth. I told her I hadn't taken a single thing that ever belonged to her. I'd simply taken back what had always, quietly, been mine. I asked her to sit down, and I walked her through it, piece by piece. The trust, the holding company, the lease, the property group, Marcus's consulting contract, all of it, the same way Priscilla had walked me through it years earlier when we first built the thing. I let each sentence hang in the air and let my daughter connect the final devastating dot herself. Did she ever wonder, I asked her, why Marcus never mentioned any other clients? Why his entire livelihood seemed to be one long consulting arrangement with her company? That $11,000 a month was his only income. Her company was his only client. And her company had never, not for one single day, belonged to her. There was a long silence on the line, and then a small, strangled sound, like something finally breaking loose inside her chest. The man her mother had chosen over me, the winner, the visionary, the one she'd been told to admire her whole life, had been living entirely off the payroll of the father she called a loser at dinner. That was the final blow, and I felt no glee in delivering it. I felt only the tired, clean relief of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for far too long. Here is the lesson buried inside all of it, the thing I understood in that moment that nobody else in this story had ever managed to see. Money handed over without wisdom attached to it isn't love. It's a cage dressed up to look like a gift. For 15 years I had confused financial rescue with fatherhood, and in doing that, I had let my own patience get mistaken for weakness, and I had quietly built a daughter who could perform success without ever once understanding where any of it actually came from. The hardest thing I've ever had to learn, at 68 years old, sitting in that quiet office with my daughter crying on the other end of a phone line, was that real love sometimes looks exactly like taking everything away. So a person is finally forced to stand on solid ground and build something true with their own two hands. I told Renata the trust still existed. Her name was still on it. But she wouldn't see a dollar of it until she'd proven, out in the world, with her own hands and her own sweat, that she could build something real, even if that something was small. Even if it started with waiting tables or answering phones at some firm that had never heard her name before. I told her it was time to learn the value of a wage she'd actually earned, and to learn humility, and most of all, to learn exactly who she was when she had nothing propping her up from behind the curtain. I hung up, and I sat there for a long while in the quiet of that little office, my reading lamp the only light on in the whole house, and I thought about the photograph on the corner of my desk, the little girl in the oversized hard hat, and I let myself grieve for a moment, honestly grieve, for the years we'd lost to a lie I helped build without ever meaning to. The days that followed were the quietest I'd known in 15 years. No frantic calls demanding I fix things. No manufactured family emergencies designed to guilt me back into the role of silent bank account. Just peace, real peace, the kind that comes after you finally set down a weight you didn't realize had been bending your spine for years. I sat out on my back porch one evening with a glass of sweet tea, listening to the cicadas start up in the oaks, and I understood something clean and simple. I had never been the embarrassment they made me out to be at that dinner table. I had been the host to something that fed on me quietly for years, and now, finally, I was free of it. And then my phone rang again. It was Diane. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some old, tired curiosity in me picked it up anyway, and I said nothing, just listened. Her voice came through ragged and panicked. Marcus's consulting contract was gone, and with it, apparently, everything else. The mortgage on their own home was suddenly underwater because it turned out Marcus had quietly borrowed against it to cover a bad investment nobody had told her about. Her car was being repossessed within the month. Her garden club membership, the one thing she still had left that made her feel like somebody, had been quietly suspended for non-payment. And somehow, in her telling of it, all of it was my fault, because I was bitter, because I'd never gotten over the divorce, because I'd decided to punish everyone around me out of spite. There was no apology in her voice for that dinner, no mention of our daughter's collapsing life, only a raw, entitled demand that I fix her world, because I had the money, and because, in her mind, I owed her. And in that moment, sitting on my porch with the tea sweating in my hand, I felt the very last thread of obligation I'd been carrying toward that woman simply turn to dust and blow off into the dark. She hadn't changed in 18 years. She was never going to. I let her run out of steam completely, let the silence stretch long and uncomfortable between us, listened to a mockingbird going through its whole repertoire in the oak by the fence, and when I finally spoke, my voice held no anger in it at all, and no satisfaction either, just a plain, permanent kind of truth. "Diane," I said, "that's no longer my problem." And I ended the call, set the phone face down on the little table beside my chair, and let the slow creak of the porch swing carry me for a while in the dark. I had gotten back my dignity. I had gotten back my peace. And in the quiet of that Charleston evening, for the first time and longer than I could honestly remember, the man they'd called an embarrassment finally felt, all the way down to his bones, like a man who'd done right by himself, at last. So let me ask you something, neighbor, before we part ways tonight, because I genuinely want to know where you stand on all this. Do you think I did right by my family, or do you think I went too far, pulling every thread out at once? Comment 1 if you believe this was hard love, exactly what my daughter needed to finally grow up. Comment 2 if you think stripping it all away in 1 week was its own kind of cruelty, no matter how it was dressed up. Or comment 3 if you think the real blame sits with Diane and Marcus, and my daughter was only ever the product the two of them built. And tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because it still amazes me how far these stories travel to reach somebody who needed to hear one. Have you ever been underestimated by the very people who owed you the most? I'd like to hear about it, neighbor to neighbor. I read every single word you leave me. And if this story found something true in you tonight, stay a while longer, because we've got plenty more evenings like this one still to come.